About 5 years ago, the leading dairy product manufacturer brand in India, Amul, launched an advertisement. This advertisement was for its ice cream brand. The advertisement told people that they should be eating ice cream made of milk instead of frozen desserts that were being made of vanaspati. Until that point, most of us had no clue what we were shoving down our mouths in the name of ice cream. The fact that there was something called frozen dessert was interesting, but even more interesting and a little troubling was the claim that these frozen desserts were being made of vanaspati. And why was this so troubling? Because this vanaspati is used to refer to a hydrogenated vegetable cooking oil, which is often used as a cheaper substitute for butter and ghee. Vanaspati is usually made from palm oil. But why does it get this bad rap? This is because vanaspati is said to be very high in trans fat, which may compose up to 50% of vanaspati. And trans fat has been shown to increase the risk of bad cholesterol in our body and also subsequently the risk of coronary artery disease. Now, coming back to the advertisement, there was one party that was clearly not amused by this advertisement. And this party was the Hindustan Unilever. Hindustan Unilever is the largest consumer goods company in India and also among the largest producers of frozen desserts through its brand Quality Walls. Hindustan Unilever went on to file a case against Amul. They raised objections over this Amul ad, which basically included shots of vanaspati flowing in a cup with frozen dessert written on it. According to them, this Amul ad was defaming the frozen desserts. What happened then? The court ruled that the ad was indeed guilty of disparaging or defaming a rival product, which in this case was Unilever's Quality Walls. However, Amul was not going to let go of this so easily. They challenged the ruling and eventually they were allowed to use these ads, but only after deleting the portion in the ad which was found to be defaming the frozen dessert. Apparently, much before these ad wars erupted, the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India had categorized ice creams under dairy-based desserts or confections and frozen dessert and frozen confection. So, ice cream means frozen milk product. This is obtained by freezing a pasteurized mix prepared from milk or other products which are derived from milk. On the other hand, frozen desserts or frozen confection mean the product derived from freezing a pasteurized mix prepared by vegetable oil or fats and vegetable protein products. Frozen desserts too may contain milk fat and other milk solids. But the main difference between these two is the type of fat used in the freezing process. So ice cream uses milk fat for the freezing process and a frozen dessert uses vegetable fat. And based on this categorization, the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India mandated that ice cream made with vegetable oil be labeled as frozen dessert, while only those products that contain milk fat be called as ice cream. And in this case, Hindustan Unilever, which is the manufacturer of Quality Walls ice cream, clarified that Quality Walls frozen dessert product did not contain vanaspati, but other kind of vegetable fat. From a health point of view, it's hard to say which one is better than the other. Because while the milk-based ice cream seems like the healthier option, the makers of frozen dessert claim that they use vegetable oil that is similar to those used for cooking at home and not the vile vanaspati version. The pricing of these ice cream and desserts too opens up an interesting question because dairy fat costs around 300 rupees per kilogram, which is about $4. Meanwhile, vegetable fats cost around 60 rupees or about $1 per kilogram. But this does not result in any price difference for the customer. Both ice cream and frozen dessert cost almost the same price. Barring a few companies in the market, most of them serve frozen desserts and not ice creams. According to ice cream manufacturers, frozen desserts have captured a market share of 40% of the 1,800 crore rupee ice cream market. Surely some of us still do not bother to look at what is in those icy desserts that we consume, milk or no milk, but for many of us, this was a reminder to look at those labels. Hello and welcome to TIL Moment. One food that has remained almost identical across the globe, also while being a favorite, is perhaps the ice cream. So tracing the history of this cool dessert also takes us across the globe. Several accounts exist about the origin of the ice cream. Some accounts suggest that the first reference point to China, where something similar to the current day snow cone was being consumed. Few others point towards Egypt. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics show a snow-filled vessel next to a fruit juice. In ancient Greece, Hippocrates, the guy with the Hippocratic oath fame, he is said to have criticized chill drinks for causing fluxes of the stomach. We need to remember that these guys were collecting the snow from mountain slopes, and we don't know what else was also being collected there. So these ice drinks are believed to have caused convulsions, colic, and a host of other ailments. Now, some others suggest that it was from ancient Persia, where sweetened water with ice and fruits was being consumed. Persian records from the 2nd century AD show sweetened chilled drinks which were made with ice from freezing water in the desert at night. It is also claimed that Roman Emperor Nero had ice collected from the Apennine Mountains to produce the first sorbet, which was made with ice mixed with honey and wine. Then there are other claims, which say that it originated in the Mongol Empire. Legend has it that Mongolian horsemen took animal intestines filled with cream to eat on their journeys across the Gobi Desert in winter. As they galloped, the cream was vigorously shaken, and while at the same time, the sub-zero temperatures of the desert froze it, creating ice cream. And as with all things in ancient history, we cannot do with Marco Polo. So our guy Marco Polo is believed to have learned of this Mongolian dessert or one of the sorbet style of the Chinese during his travels and then brought it back to Europe. So from all these accounts, basically we do not know. We do not know who started it, and if all these guys were consuming these snow cones or some other flavor, perhaps one of them started it and it became some sort of a viral sensation. The closest and a little similar to our current day ice cream is one from China. In the Tang dynasty, around the 7th and the 8th century, Shang, the 7th Tang emperor, is said to have eaten a dish prepared from kumis. Kumis is a Central Asian thin yogurt-like drink made from fermented mare's milk. This was thickened with flour and flavored with camphor. This drink was then lowered into ice pools to refrigerate, creating something similar to an ice cream. Across these different cultures though, one thing was certain. It was meant only for the wealthy and privileged ones. The rest of us, or maybe our ancestors, would need to wait for several centuries more before it became a relish for us to savor. Also, so far, it was only technically chilled desserts, not frozen. Iced or frozen cream would be possible only with the discovery of something which is now called endothermic effect. This process is in fact used to make ice creams at homes even today. And this would be the first step towards the invention of the ice cream as we know it today. So, how do we go about this endothermic process then? Well, you just add salt to water. That's it. But what's the magic that happens with salt in water? The movement of water molecules is dependent on the temperature of water. So warm temperature means fast movement, and if the movement gets fast enough, we have steam. Similarly, cold temperatures means less movement until we reach a temperature that is low enough to stop molecular movement altogether. This is what we call freezing. The water molecules bond together into a crystalline structure of ice. Now, the freezing point of water, which we have all learned, is 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, how does salt make a difference? The presence of salt in water though reduces this freezing point of water. The more salt in the water, the lower the freezing point will be. The presence of salt makes it harder for water molecules to bond to the ice structure. So salt essentially gets into the way of water molecules, blocking them from joining into ice. So basically, it reduces the freezing point of water from the known 0 degrees Celsius, and water remains as water for much longer, but it becomes much colder too. And how does this help with the ice cream? When ice cream is made, it's placed into a container and then rotated within an ice bath. If no salt is added to this ice bath, the lowest temperature it can reach is 0 degrees Celsius. While the cream would still freeze at this temperature, it can do that much more quickly at a lower temperature. This salt water has a lower freezing point, so the temperature of that ice bath can get even colder, thus freezing the ice cream more quickly. This is what is called as an endothermic process. Now, what is interesting is that the first reference to this process comes from our very own Panchatantra stories. For those who are not aware, Panchatantra is an ancient Indian collection of animal fable stories. Most scholarly consensus place the Panchatantra stories to have originated around 300 CE. Panchatantra says, water only becomes really cool when it contains salt. This is believed to be the first known record of this endothermic process. And this would be the process that would be used to make ice cream late until the 20th century, the time when artificial and electric refrigeration was invented. But we get ahead of ourselves. Let us get back to the good times of the Mongol warlords and their tasty ice creams in animal intestines. In medieval times, Arabs are said to have been drinking an icy refreshment called sherbet or sharab in Arabic. These chill drinks were often flavored with fruits like cherry, pomegranates or quince. This icy flavored syrup entered India along with the Turks and the Afghans. The Moroccan travel writer Ibn Battuta mentions of an event in Delhi during the time that he was here. It was somewhere in the mid-1300s, in the days of the Delhi Sultanate. He mentions great basins filled with a kind of sweetened water, flavored with rose water. He states, they offer cups of gold, silver and glass filled with sugar water. They call it sherbet and drink it before eating. As the Delhi Sultanate gave way to the Mughal Empire, the sherbet too was making a way for another stronger player in the business of ice desserts, the Kulfi. In his book Sweet Invention, A History of Dessert, Michael Crondall states the following about this transition. Quote, by the Mughal period, these soft drinks were often chilled, and a great deal of money and effort were devoted to procuring ice and snow to this end. Abul Fazl devoted several pages to the matter in the Ain-e-Akbari, his meticulous dissertation on the administration of the Emperor Akbar's empire. Ice and snow were transported 500 miles from the Himalayas by carriage, by boat, and also on foot. Even more intriguing, the Mughals had figured out how to chill water by the use of saltpeter. If enough of the chemical is stirred into water, it will actually cause the water to freeze. It is this technology, initially developed to chill drinks, that likely led to kulfi, the Indian answer to ice cream. Certainly one of the more delightful outcomes of the encounter of the Mughal and indigenous sweet makers. According to the Indian food historian K.T. Achaya, these desserts were first made in the 16th century. A mixture of dense evaporated milk, so common in the Hindu sweetmeats, was flavored with pistachios and saffron, then packed into metal cones before being immersed into an ice slurry, a procedure that is followed even today. The word kulfi comes from the Persian term kulfi, meaning a covered cup. End quote. These creamy kulfis even to this day come in these two forms, as cones on sticks or in a covered cup, which is called the matka, famously being called as the matka kulfi, and has remained as one of the favorite desserts of India. While this was the eastward journey of the sherbet, as with most things in those times, it travelled westwards too. The Italians called this sherbet as sorbetto, and the French would later call it sorbet. The first recipe in French for flavored ice would appear in 1674 in a book by Nicolas Lemery, who was a French chemist. Meanwhile, in Italy, Antonio Latini, a kitchen overseer for the Spanish viceroy in Naples, published the first book of sorbetto recipes in 1694. It included flavors like lemon, strawberry, even eggplant and chocolate, which was the new and exciting popular entry to the food scene in Europe at the time. One of his recipes was a sorbet with various candied things that would have included candied citron, lemon or pumpkin mixed with milk, water and sugar. This is widely considered as the first documented ice cream as we know it today. The next guy is a Frenchman, Nicolas Odiger. He is said to have been trained in Italy. He improved on Latini's method, but he insisted his cooks to stir the mixture as they froze to give the resulting product a lighter texture. In France, this new dish would be called fromage glacé, which is basically frozen or iced candied cheese. A name popular now in the world of ice creams, gelato, was also being churned at this time. Gelato is a type of ice cream which has less air than the usual ice cream. This gelato is credited to an Italian chef, Francesco Procopio di Coltelli. In the late 1600s, he is said to have opened his cafe called Café Procope in Paris. He introduced gelato at this cafe. It became famous first in Paris and then the rest of Europe. Thanks to this gelato, Procopio not only obtained French citizenship, but is also said to have got an exclusive royal license issued by King Louis XIV, making him the sole producer of this frozen dessert in the kingdom. And the ice cream by now had travelled to England. King Charles II, who reigned between 1660 and 1685, is said to have built an ice house in the centre of London, and that too at the start of his reign. And as it is with all other things, ice cream would reach its super popularity only in the US. And again, as with all things, America would truly demonstrate how to democratize and commercialize this ice cream. In 1790, the first ice cream parlor opened in New York. Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson were all known to be big fans of this ice cream. Records kept by a merchant from Chatham Street in New York show that George Washington spent approximately $200 on ice cream in the summer of 1790, which in today's money would be a little over $6,000. The same records show President Thomas Jefferson as having an 18-step recipe for ice cream. He is said to have kept several ice houses, which was able to hold 62 wagon loads of ice along with huge quantities of ice cream. In fact, ice harvesting was a major trade in the 19th and early 20th century. It was centered around the east coast of the United States and also in Norway. Ice was cut from the surface of ponds and streams, then stored in ice houses before it was sent off on ship or by barge or railroad to its final destination around the world, not just in the US. This ice trade was started by a New England businessman, Frederick Tudor, in 1806. He went on to be known as the Yankee Ice King. At its peak, at the end of the 19th century, this US ice trade is said to have employed about 90,000 people in the industry. And the ice houses that were being used were capable of storing up to 250,000 tons of ice each. This ice harvesting would eventually subside with the coming of artificially produced plant ice and also the refrigeration facilities, but only towards the beginning of the 20th century. But through this time of ice harvesting, the popularity of our ice cream was growing. In 1885, a woman who would eventually go on to be called as the Queen of Ices was granted a patent for an improved ice cream machine. This machine could freeze a pint of ice cream in just 5 minutes. This Queen of Ices was Agnes Marshall. She was a leading culinary writer in the Victorian period. She had in fact also suggested using liquid nitrogen to make ice cream, a method which is being used by some of the restaurants even today. But ice cream was still being made and sold only by small businesses at this time. A man called Jacob Fussell would be the first one to manufacture ice cream on a large scale. He was a dairyman in the United States. An unstable demand for his dairy products meant a lot of surplus of cream, which he then started turning into ice cream. He built his first ice cream factory in Seven Valleys in Pennsylvania. This was in 1851. Later, he opened factories in several other cities, and also, a good man that he was, he taught the business to others, who would then go on to open their own plants. This mass production reduced the cost of ice cream and increased its popularity. Now, we are getting closer to our times. 100 years more to go. During the 1870s, a German engineer called Carl von Linde developed industrial refrigeration. This eliminated the need to cut and store this natural ice. Once commercial refrigeration was in place, in the beginning of the 20th century, mass production of ice cream and the birth of our modern ice cream industry was truly unstoppable. Towards the late 19th century, poor Italians had started migrating to the UK and the US, and these guys were bringing their ice cream traditions with them. These vendors started selling their ice creams and were apparently calling out on the streets as Ochi Poco or Sen Poco, which meant, oh, how little, and here's a little bit. This Ochi Poco and Sen Poco would go on to be known as the Hokey Pokey ice creams. Meanwhile, in England, street vendors were using small glass containers to serve ice cream. These containers were made of a thick glass, and they were designed in a way that the contents appeared larger than what was actually placed in them. These vendors would sell this ice cream for 1 penny, and the way to eat this ice cream was to lick the glass. This was called the penny lick ice cream. It's exactly how we lick the ice cream cone today, but instead of the edible cone, the glass container would have to be returned back to the vendor. And the vendor supposedly just dunked this glass in a basin of water and would just reuse it, turning this glass container into a cup of bacteria and virus. So the container was actually showing more than what the consumer saw. The penny lick was banned in London in 1898 because of concerns about the spread of disease, particularly cholera and tuberculosis. This eventually led to the obvious solution for us now, the ice cream cone. While the unhygienic cup was one reason, the other was that the glasses that were used to serve these ice creams were constantly being stolen or broken. This would lead to a vendor who was called Italo Marcioni to introduce a pastry cup in New York City, and this would eventually turn into the ice cream cone. But he is just one of who is credited with the invention of the cone. But anyway, the final push to the popularity of our ice cream would come in the US in the 1920s. Between 1920 to 1933 in the United States, a nationwide constitutional ban on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages was placed. So, salons that were earlier selling alcohol switched to ice cream and soda, the famous duo of the United States. This popularity of this ice dessert, especially in the United States, would be demonstrated during the Second World War. During the war, to meet the needs of the troop, the United States Navy employed an ice cream barge. It's said to have been able to create 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes. In 1942, when Japanese torpedoes sank the USS Lexington, which was the second largest aircraft carrier of the US Navy at the time, the crew abandoned the ship. But before doing that, they apparently broke into the freezer and ate all of the ice cream. The aircrew took a different approach. They attached a 5-gallon can to their aircraft. They filled it with an ice cream mix. The movement of the aircraft and the intense cold of the high altitude gave them a smooth and cold ice cream as they landed. It was also around this time that the famous names in the world of ice cream today were taking shape. Baskin-Robbins, the American multinational brand of ice cream, was one of them. It was named after its founders, Bart Baskin and Irv Robbins. Bert Paskin learned how to make ice cream while he was in the military during the Second World War. He applied this knowledge that he had gained and set up Burton's Ice Cream Shop in 1946. And in 1948, he would join forces with his brother-in-law, and the company they created was called Baskin-Robbins. Another popular brand was also being set up by this time, Häagen-Dasz. Although in this case there was no one called Hagen or any Bengali Das Babu behind this brand, sadly. Reuben Matos was born in Poland in 1912 to Jewish parents. His father died during the First World War, and his widowed mother migrated to New York City along with her 2 children in 1921. They joined an uncle who was in the Italian lemon ice business in Brooklyn. By the late 1920s, the family began making ice pops, and by 1929, chocolate-covered ice cream bars and sandwiches under the name Senator Frozen Products. Although Senator Frozen Products Company was profitable, by the 1950s, there were many ice cream brands that were coming into the space. This resulted in a price war, and Mr. Matus had a brilliant idea. He decided to make a heavy kind of high-end ice cream, and in 1959, he decided to form a new ice cream company. He apparently wanted a Danish-sounding name for his brand, and this was supposed to be a tribute to Denmark's exemplary treatment of Jews during the World War II. And the name that he thought sounded Danish enough was Häagen-Dasz, which would eventually take form in the 1960s. With refrigeration coming into our homes and also becoming a cheap utility, the popularity of ice cream soared through the second half of the 20th century. Ice creams today still continue to be a favorite, young or old and in all shapes and forms. Be it the Korean bingsu in its shaved ice form, the vermicelli of the Persian faluda, the antiques of the Turkish dondurma ice cream vendor, the Italian gelatos, the homely and rich Indian matka kulfis, or the granddaddy of them all, the snow cones in the form of sorbets, ice pops or lollies. But it's important to note that it is not all cool stuff. So our ice cream is a dessert, so it is high in sugar and rich in fat. Apart from all the artificial sweeteners, stabilizers, emulsifiers, all of which go into our ice creams and frozen desserts today. And all this talk of sugar, fat and artificial additives definitely attracts the elite trio of obesity, diabetes and heart disease. So making it cheap and accessible was not the best thing for us then. But well, we read our health columns. Everything in moderation. Don't take inspiration from the movies where the protagonist sits with a bucket of ice cream in an effort to overcome the ache of a broken heart. But if you need one now to treat the ache of your tired ear, I would not be the one to blame you. Until the next time then, with more facts, trivia and a whole new story.